get frostbite.
Can't handle your drink. Teamwork is dreamwork.
Brace yourself. This is gonna hurt.
Disgusting.
Hey, what's up YouTube, and welcome to my Child Guide. As you know, Child's rerun banner just ended, and with that, I just finished building my Child. And so I thought it'd be time to make a guide for him. Child is an amazing Hydra DPS unit that excels at AoE multi-target damage. He's great at applying the Hydra status to many characters and enemies around him, and has a lot of hidden tips and tricks that I'm going to teach you guys. First, I'm going to showcase my Child that I'm going to be using through this guide, and I'll go over the weapons, artifacts, talent, and skills that you need to know for Child. My Child is 80 out of 90, has 61% crit rate, 140% crit damage, 117 energy recharge, and 90% hydro damage bonus. He has an R5 Rust, level 90. I have him on the Heart, 4-piece Heart of Depth set. 0 Constellations on him, and his talents are 8, 8, 8. I'm going to go over Child's talents and abilities first, because for Child, his talents highly influence what you should build on him. First thing I want to talk about is Child's unique ability, Riptide. Riptide is a debuff that Child will apply on enemies, and it could be applied in various ways. The first way we're going to talk about is how his Riptide can be applied during his charge attack on his bow. But charge attacking is slow, so the main way you apply Riptide is through his charge attack with his E skill. And if you take a look at one of his talents, Sword of Torrents, whenever you are in your E skill, whenever you auto attack and land a crit, you will apply Riptide to the hit characters. So on the topic of Riptide, let's get back into Child's E skill, because that is the stance you'll be mostly applying Riptide to. Upon entering Child's melee stance, he will unleash hydro damage to the surrounding opponents, which may ruin some vaporize. So whenever you enter his melee stance and you want to vaporize some enemies, stand away and then hit him with the vaporize. But most of the time, it won't make much of a DPS difference. In this stance, Child becomes a melee sword user that deals only hydro damage, and his E skill has a passive ability, Riptide Slash. Hitting an opponent affected by Riptide with a melee attack unleashes Riptide Slash that deals AoE hydro damage. Child's E skill is great at applying hydro damage to surrounding enemies, mostly in clusters, so when you proc Riptide Slash, it deals massive damage to all enemies around it. Think of Child's melee stance as a character enhancing ultimate. Child is buffed during the duration of that stance, but once the stance is over, usually takes longer than other skills to charge back up. You can only stay in his melee stance for 30 seconds, and you can effectively cancel his melee stance ability at any time, so the cooldown ranges from 6 seconds to 36 seconds. And if you never cancel the melee stance ability at all, the initial cooldown will be 45 seconds. So keep this in mind when you're using Child, so your Child's elemental skill cooldown doesn't last a year. But when you're in your Child's melee stance for 9 seconds, your cooldown for your skill is going to be 15 seconds. This is the most optimal time for you to utilize your off-field supports, seeing that Child is going to apply the Hydra status to all the characters around him. Utilizing an off-field support damage dealer like Xiangling or Fischl to apply a different element to proc with Hydro will be the most optimal setup. As you can see, of the massive amount of elemental reactions I am able to create with the constant stream of reactions from Fischl, Xiangling, and Child. Because of the nature of Child's E skill, I like to have another DPS in the party as sort of a backup DPS when Child's E skill is down, and when his burst is down, I can swap to my secondary DPS and keep dealing damage while my Child is recharging his cooldown. For this clip, I'm able to use Ball as my secondary DPS when my Child DPS is off cooldown. His E skill was on cooldown for about 17 seconds, and in that time, I swapped to my Ball, my Bennett, and my Xiangling to deal their burst damage, and once Child's E skill is back up, my Xiangling deals constant pyro damage, and my Child deals constant hydro damage, and they can deal a continuous vaporize and finish everyone off with a final Ball ultimate. One final thing to note is that Child's E skill is considered charged attack and normal attack damage, so the skill will gain buffs from external sources that buff normal and charged attack damage. Some prime examples being the Rust and the Hydro Heart of Depth set. Next, let's get into Child's elemental skill, which is one of my most favorite skills in the entire game. So Child basically has 2 elemental skills because he has 2 forms, and each elemental burst can be activated within his respective form. So first, let's start with Child's ranged stance ultimate. So he will shoot an arrow into the sky, and then it will fall to the ground, dealing massive hydro damage and applying the Riptide status to all the surrounding enemies. And as you can see in his attributes section, the ranged stance does less damage, but it refunds 1/3 of your energy. For Child's melee stance burst, he will deal a large AoE damage, dealing hydro damage to all surrounding characters, and then triggers Riptide Blast to all enemies that have the Riptide debuff already applied. When using Child's burst abilities, there are optimal times to use his burst. Using his ranged stance elemental burst will apply Riptide to all enemies, so using his ranged elemental burst first, and then swapping into your melee stance will deal a large amount of Riptide AoE damage. On the other hand, if you wanted to use Child's burst ability in his melee stance, I would recommend swapping into your melee stance, afflicting everyone with the Riptide status, and then finishing them all off with a burst that deals massive Hydro AoE damage, and then hits them all off with a Riptide Blast. His next skill, Never Ending, extends the Riptide duration for 8 seconds. His skill, Sword of Torrents, we already went over. It basically allows you to apply the Riptide status to enemies in your melee stance after you land a crit. Last passive talent is one of my favorites in the entire game. It increases your own party member's normal attack level by 1. Now this doesn't sound super overpowered or anything, but if you think about it, let's say your character has a normal attack at level 9. If you had Child on your team, this would push him up to 10, and this is basically saving you a free crown, 700k more, and a bunch of enhancing books. Now this is only for one character on your team. You can have up to 4 characters on your team, and Child does buff his own normal attack with his passive talent. Now the one thing I'm confused about with miHoYo is why did they put this passive talent on Child? Child does not utilize normal attacks as well as other characters. I would see this ability going great with someone like Eula or Jean, someone that utilizes their normal attacks a lot more. But in the end, I see this as the strongest passive talent on any character in the game. Next, let's get into our weapons for Child. Currently, I like to run an R5 Rust on Child because I mainly use him as a sub DPS for my team. What the Rust does is increases normal attack damage by a percentage amount, but decreases charge attack damage by 10%. This increases with refinement, but it is hard to get, being that is a gacha weapon, and you need to pull on banners to get this weapon. The next option I would go for is the Stringless. Even though it does have elemental mastery, it's not the best of substats, but the passive reads increases elemental skill and burst damage by 24%. His melee stance and his ult both proc off of the Stringless's passive and does quite a lot of damage, but it is also a gacha weapon and may be hard to obtain. The most free-to-play option I would go for is the Favonius Warbow. It has 61% energy recharge as a substat, and crits have a 90% chance to generate a small amount of elemental particles, which will regenerate 6 energy for the character and can only occur a certain amount of seconds. This increases with refinement. This weapon is great for generating energy for Child so he can ult more times and for your entire team. Child does have a lot of 5-star options, but since I don't own any of the 5-star options, I was not able to test any of them, and I will not give you guys false information, so I'm just going to end it at that. Next, let's get into Child's main artifact sets. When Child first came out, he didn't have a set artifact set for him. So on release, Child felt like this wonky character which didn't really have a place in the current meta. So the go-to artifact set for Child in the beginning was a Noblesse Oblige set because the set was so versatile with every single character. It increases his burst damage and also pumped out a buff to his team, which got them to deal more damage as well. And in the beginning, that did work out well because you want to have Child stick around for the entire duration of the fight, and after you ulted with him, you could take your Child out of the party, have the rest of your characters deal the damage while his melee stance is on cooldown, and then once it's back up, you just do the rotation again. But soon after Child's first rerun banner and the release of Dragonspine, Child got his own dedicated artifact set. This set's 2-piece reads Hydro damage bonus is increased by 15%, and the 4-piece reads after using an elemental skill, increase normal attack and charge attack damage by 30% for 15 seconds. This artifact set pointed Child into the direction of a sub DPS. With this artifact set, you focused more on Child's charged attacks and normal attacks rather than his high scaling burst ability. But later, in the release of Inazuma, we got the artifact set known as the Shimenawa set. The Shimenawa set and Child's Hydro Heart of Depth set are closely similar in the fact that they both increase charge attacks, except the Shimenawa set is more versatile, but you trade energy for more damage output. Its 2-piece reads attack is increased by 18%, and when casting an elemental skill, if the character has 15 or more energy, they lose 15 energy, and normal charged plunge attack damage is increased by 50% for 10 seconds. When testing this set on Child, I found that I could rarely ever get Child's burst up because using his melee stance hardly gives any hydro particles, and therefore I couldn't ult on Child as much as I wanted to. So now I'm going to provide a demonstration with the 4-piece Shimenawa set equipped on my Child. I want you guys to mainly focus on my energy as I progress through killing all these enemies. So when I first start out, I have a little bit less than half my energy bar filled, but once I use Child's melee stance ability, I lose almost all my entire ult gauge. It takes me all the rest of these mobs to fill my ult gauge back up. But once I do turn back to my rage stance, I lose my energy again. So make sure if you are running a 4-piece Shimenawa set to use your ult before you go back to your range stance to reset your melee stance cooldown. The last 2 main sets for Child have all been charge attack based, mostly equipped towards his melee stance, but Genshin Impact isn't always just black and white best set and worst set for Child. If you want to spice things up, you could also go for an ult Child set, which is a 2-piece Noblesse and a 2-piece Hydro damage bonus set. They will both increase his ult's damage and its massive scaling. The 2-piece Noblesse Oblige set gives you 20% burst damage bonus, and the 2-piece Heart of Depth set gives you a 15% Hydro damage bonus, which both scale off of your ultimate ability. The main con with this setup for Child is you're taking away damage from his charge attack abilities. So if you just want to use Child to inflict the Hydro status on enemies, maybe with a Xiangling Bennett comp, a burst Child team could be quite okay with your comp. Next, let's get into artifact substats for Child. When building Child, you're going to want to build him like a main DPS, so crit damage, crit rate, and attack percent. Next to your priority is Elemental Mastery or Energy Recharge, and then HP percent, defense percent last. For your sands, you want to go attack percent. For your Goblet, you're going to want to go Hydro damage, and for your Circlet, you want to go either crit damage or crit rate depending on what stats you have at the moment. Next, let's get into Child's Constellations. I'm going to warn you guys ahead of time, its Constellations are not worth investing in. He's perfectly fine at C0, and I think he should be left at C0 as well. Child's C1 ability reads, decreases the cooldown of Foul Legacy Raging Tide by 20%. So basically what this does is decreases the cooldown off of your melee stance. His C2 is when opponents affected by Riptide are defeated, Tartaglia regenerates 4 elemental energy. His C4 is when he's in Foul Legacy Raging Tide, his melee stance triggers Riptide Slash against opponents in the field affected by Riptide. Every 4 seconds, otherwise triggers Riptide Flash. When Riptide Slash and Riptide Flash triggered by this Constellation effect are not subject to the time intervals that would typically apply to 2 Riptide effects, nor do they have any effects to those time intervals. This Constellation basically does, because it's pretty long, is it just procs a Riptide effect more. And we'll get onto that in the talents section, what Riptide is. Finally, Childe's C6 ability basically just lets him stay in his melee stance for however long he wants and just go full Unga Bunga mode and just slap enemies all around. Next, let's get into team comps for Childe. Next, let's go on to Childe's team comps. Childe's team comps can be more important than the actual gameplay of Childe itself. With Childe, you want to make sure you're dealing damage even if your abilities are on cooldown. And that brings us to the first team comp I have in mind for Childe. The first team I'd like to show you guys is a Childe Xiangling Vape comp. While Childe is afflicting everyone with Hydro, Xiangling will continuously vape all the enemies, leading to massive amounts of damage, which sometimes your Xiangling can even deal more damage than your Childe. I like to use Bennett paired with Xiangling because you're able to snapshot Bennett's ult with Xiangling's burst and vice versa. Then I have Ball on the team for more energy for the rest of my characters, and a second sub DPS when Childe's out of his burst. Once Ball is out of her burst, Childe is up again and can therefore keep the cycle going, dealing constant damage with my party. Next team comp I have for you guys is a Childe Beidou team comp, which revolves around the Electrocharge reaction. Childe will afflict everyone with Hydro, and with Beidou's ulti will also afflict everyone with Electrocharge. Beidou's ultimate is quite high, so we have Fischl as a battery, and then we get the Electro Resonance, which makes it easier for in the entire party to gain energy. And then we have Bennett for the heals and also his damage buff. Next, let's get into the damage showcase.
Animal test 6308. Look at you, Foodhound. Everybody stand back. Let's light it up.
Shouldn't let your guard down.
I'm going in. Eat this. After right hand into the
Tidal wave. Shouldn't let your guard down.
Let's light it up. Adventure time. Illusion shattered!
Yeah! Brace yourself! This is gonna hurt!
You're a cut.
Let's light it up!
Yeah!
Stand clear! Look at you, Foodhound! Teamwork is dreamwork!
Shouldn't let your guard down.
You'll get frostbite.
Can't handle your drink! Teamwork is dreamwork!
Brace yourself! This is gonna hurt!
Disgusting. I'm gonna sweat.
Shine down! Torn to oblivion! Everybody stand back! Illusion! Eat this! Nice and spicy!
Brace yourself! This is gonna hurt!
Let's light it up! Booba, get them! Inazuma shines eternal!
There's no escape!
I'm going in! You're toast!
Thank you guys so much for watching. As you can see, Childe is a great enabler as well as a sub DPS. He has amazing burst and hydro damage and is able to take you all the way to floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. And overall, I enjoy his playstyle. The fact that he can switch between ranged and melee forms is like playing two characters rolled into one, and you'll never run out of fun things you can do with Childe. That's all for this, guys, and see you in the next video.